James is 44. He runs the communications division of a mid-sized technology firm, a role he built over 2 decades through genuine competence and a refined instinct for how organizations present themselves to the world. On LinkedIn, he has accumulated 28,000 followers through polished professional content, essays on leadership, observations about team culture, photographs from industry conferences where he is always present and always composed. His posts receive thousands of likes. Colleagues describe him as incredibly authentic online. In the evenings, when the laptop closes and the apartment is quiet, James sits with a feeling he has not been able to name. It is not depression. He is checked, twice, with a clinician he trusts. It is not grief. There is no loss he can identify. It is something closer to the experience of removing a costume you have been wearing so long that you have forgotten what your body looks like underneath, and have discovered, in the moment of attempted removal, that you are not certain the removal is even possible. He has built an identity that functions exceptionally well. It generates professional momentum that appears entirely self-sustaining. The values it expresses were not invented from nothing. The intelligence it displays is real. And yet something is wrong in a way James cannot locate, because the thing that would help him locate it is the very thing the performance has been drowning out. His therapist suggested journaling. James opens the document. He types 3 sentences. He closes it. He does not know who is supposed to be speaking. This is not a social media problem. This is something older, something Jung noticed in the consulting room a century ago, described with a concept borrowed from classical antiquity. This is educational content exploring Jungian psychology. It is not a substitute for professional mental health support. If you are struggling, please seek qualified help. The case presented is entirely fictional, constructed to illustrate a psychological concept. Jung introduced the concept of the persona, from the Latin word for the masks worn by actors in antiquity, to describe the social face an individual presents to the outer world. The etymology is precise and worth holding. These were literal objects, clay or wood constructions that Roman actors held before their faces so that audiences could identify the role being performed at a distance. The persona announces, "This is the character I am playing in this scene." For Jung, the psychological persona performs the same function. But the persona, in Jung's framing, is not deception. It is not inauthenticity in any simple sense. It is a genuine psychological structure that serves a real and necessary function. The ongoing negotiation between who one privately is and what the social environment requires in order to function. In the Collected Works, Volume 7, Jung described the persona as serving as a compromise between individual and society. CW Volume 7, Section 305, a formulation worth dwelling on carefully. Not a betrayal of the individual, not a capitulation to society. A compromise, which means both parties are present in the agreement, and both parties, ideally, retain something of their own nature in the transaction. To understand what happens when persona identification becomes total, it helps to understand the broader psychological architecture Jung was working within. The persona is not an isolated structure. It sits in a specific relationship with other dimensions of psychic life. On one side of the persona is the world, the social environment with its demands, its hierarchies, its continuous evaluative attention. The persona faces outward toward this world, the ego's ambassador to the outer realm, the version of the self shaped for legibility and social functionality. On the other side is the shadow, the repository of everything the persona has excluded in the process of becoming the right kind of person for the social environment. Every trait that was suppressed, every impulse that did not fit the role, every capacity or vulnerability that had no place in the curated identity, all of it accumulates in what Jung called the shadow. The more elaborately constructed the persona, the denser and more pressurized the shadow becomes in consequence. There is a third element that receives less popular attention, what Jung referred to as the self, not the ego self, but the totality of the psyche, including its unconscious dimensions and unlived potential. The process Jung called individuation requires an ongoing, living relationship between the ego and this broader self. But if the persona becomes too successful, if it consumes all available psychic energy in the management of its own performance, The ego's relationship with the inner world begins to atrophy in ways that accumulate over years. This is the mechanism James is experiencing. The construction of his professional identity was not cynical. It drew on genuine aspects of himself. But over 20 years, the feedback loop between the performance and its rewards has been so relentlessly reinforcing that the performance has become self-sustaining. It no longer requires the interior self to fuel it. And the interior self, receiving no attention, no invitation to participate, has become very quiet. James Hollis argues that persona rigidity, the condition in which the social mask becomes so fixed and so densely rewarded that it can no longer flex or breathe, is one of the defining features of midlife psychological crisis. Not that midlife brings new problems from outside. It brings an accumulated cost from inside. The persona that worked at 30 can become, by 45, a structure the person is trapped inside rather than expressed through. The mask that was once a tool has become the room in which the person now lives. The standard cultural response to this crisis is to rebuild a better persona, rebrand, develop a more authentic personal narrative, start a new content strategy that performs authenticity more convincingly. This is, from a Jungian perspective, precisely the wrong response. It treats the crisis as a problem of self-presentation when the actual problem is one of self-contact. The question Jung's framework poses is not, what should you present to the world? It is, what have you stopped presenting to yourself? In CW9I, Jung observed that the persona as a mode of adaptation functions well until the demands of the outer world become so totalizing that the inner world receives no nourishment. CW Volume 9I, Section 221. That formulation maps directly onto the experience of the professional whose identity exists almost entirely in the external register, validated by metrics, shaped by algorithms, constituted almost entirely by how it appears to others. Jung wrote that formulation in the early 20th century. It describes the early 21st century with something close to prophecy. Return to James. His clinician found no depression, no anxiety disorder meeting diagnostic criteria, nothing to treat in the conventional clinical sense. And that assessment was accurate within its framework. What James experiences is not quite a symptom. It is an absence. The feeling of having become exceptionally accomplished at being someone he cannot fully locate anymore. From a Jungian perspective, what James is experiencing is the logical, almost inevitable consequence of a very successful persona. The success is precisely the problem. Had the persona been less effective, had the professional identity provoked more friction, more failure, the interior self would have had occasion to speak. Failure is one of the primary channels through which the unconscious communicates with the ego. It interrupts the performance and creates gaps through which the interior life can become briefly audible. But James has not failed. His persona has worked with remarkable consistency for 2 decades, never giving the interior self a gap large enough to speak through. It has not been suppressed through any act of deliberate will. It has simply been crowded out, gradually, continuously, by the success of the thing that replaced it. The 3-sentence journal entry that trails off into silence is not writer's block. It is the sound of someone asked, for the first time in a very long time, to speak without a platform, without an audience, without the scaffolding of the professional performance, and who has discovered, with quiet alarm, that they are not sure who is supposed to respond. The persona James has constructed is oriented toward a particular kind of visibility, public, professional, continuously curated. The feedback loops that reinforce it are constant and externalized. A post goes out, engagement metrics arrive within hours. The approval is quantified with precision by 28,000 people. What this creates is a particular form of dependence. James has come to know himself primarily through the responses of others, through metrics, through the aggregated responses of people who know only the carefully constructed public self. Jung observed that one of the central developmental tasks of mature psychological life is the differentiation of the ego from the persona, the gradual discovery that one is not identical with one's social role. This differentiation requires what Hollis calls, with considerable precision, the courage to disappoint, the willingness to be less legible, less immediately pleasing to the outer world in order to become more present to something that has been waiting inside it. For James, this would not look like quitting LinkedIn or making any dramatic gesture of renunciation. It would look, initially, like almost nothing visible from the outside. It would look like sitting with the blankness in the journal document and tolerating the silence rather than closing the laptop. It would look like noticing what arises when the performance is suspended, not to curate it for an audience, but simply to acknowledge that something is there, beneath the persona, that has been waiting for a long time for someone to ask what it has to say. One might ask, with genuine curiosity rather than accusation, when the last time was that one did something that required no audience, no documentation, no external validation. Not as a test of authenticity, as a simple diagnostic question about where the self currently lives, and whether it has any habitats genuinely its own and not organized around performance or reception. If the answer is difficult to locate, if the activities that come to mind all have some dimension of visibility built into them, that difficulty is informative. It does not indicate failure. It indicates the degree to which the persona has expanded to fill the available space. One might also ask, if the persona one is built were somehow suspended, the professional role, the curated identity, the reputation that precedes one into every room, what would remain? Not what one hopes would remain. What one genuinely suspects is there. Jung's framework does not suggest that the persona should be dismantled or that professional identity is a form of corruption. It suggests something more specific, that behind the persona, there is something the persona was always supposed to serve, something that existed before the professional identity was constructed. And if one has lost contact with what that is, if the persona has become the master rather than the instrument, then the persona, however successful, has achieved something other than what it was built for. The platforms that shape how we present ourselves to one another reward consistency, recognizability, and the steady performance of a legible professional self. There is no platform for the interior. There is no metric for the person behind the performance. Jung's insight, that a persona too successfully maintained eventually empties the self it was supposed to represent, is not a clinical observation from a century ago. It is something approaching cultural prophecy. The self that exists beneath the performance is not the enemy of the performance. The person wearing a living persona and the one trapped inside a consumed one may look identical from the outside. The difference is known in the quiet moments, usually when the laptop closes. James's situation is representative of something Jung identified as one of the central reckonings of the second half of life. The moment when the structures that carried the first half have been so thoroughly built, so consistently reinforced, that they have used up the resources they were supposed to be expressing. The persona succeeded. The self, in the process, was crowded out. That is not a character flaw. It is the logical outcome of an environment that rewards the performance continuously and provides no occasion, no language, no scaffolding for attending to the person behind it. The question James cannot answer when he opens the journal, who is supposed to be speaking, is not a writing problem. It is an identity problem. The interior self has not disappeared. It has simply been given nothing to do for long enough that it has lost the habit of speaking. Developing that habit again is the work of the second half of life. It begins not with grand gestures, but with the small, uncomfortable act of staying with the silence rather than immediately filling it with performance. This is educational content exploring Jungian psychology. It is not a substitute for professional mental health support. The Shadow Work PDF, 5 Questions to Begin, is available through the link in the description. Subscribe if you want to continue this conversation. There is considerably more to examine, and none of it moves quickly.